A boy was selling fruit on the street to buy food for his disabled grandfather when his older brother showed up and took all the money for medicine. Until a car with a millionaire arrived at his house, and Michael adjusted the piles of apples and oranges on his cart with meticulous care. Each piece of fruit represented more than just a sale. It was a lifeline. Every apple handed over, every orange exchanged for a few coins brought him closer to his goal, his grandmother's medicine. For most kids, 12 years old was still an age of carelessness. But Michael had no such luxury. His small frame carried a heavy burden, one that weighed more with every passing day. While other children played in the streets, chasing after balls and laughing freely, Michael stood by busy sidewalks, his eyes scanning for potential customers. His voice, polite but firm, echoed among the foot traffic. Fresh apples, juicy oranges, just 50 cents each. Few stopped, and even fewer bought. But Michael kept his smile. He couldn't afford not to. With every coin dropped into his pocket, he felt a flicker of hope. A little closer, just a little more, and he could buy the medicine his grandmother so desperately needed. Margaret was everything to Michael. After the accident that took his parents, she had taken him in, offering him love and stability, even when her health began to deteriorate. Now, it was his turn to take care of her, and Michael was determined not to fail. The thought of losing her kept him awake most nights, a silent fear gnawing at him like an ache that wouldn't fade. But each day, he fought back, standing behind his cart, selling fruit and collecting coins like they were pieces of a miracle. When evening came, Michael dragged his cart home, his feet aching from the long day. Inside their small apartment, the air felt heavy with exhaustion and worry. Margaret lay on the worn couch, her breathing shallow, her face pale but warm with the same gentle smile she always gave him. "You did good today, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice weak. Michael knelt beside her, kissed her hand and nodded. "I'm almost there, Grandma. Just a little more." She stroked his hair slowly, her touch feather-light. "You're such a good boy, Michael. I wish you didn't have to do so much." Michael smiled, hiding the lump forming in his throat. He wouldn't let her see his fear. He couldn't. Once Margaret drifted off to sleep, Michael went to his small room. He reached into the back of his closet, pulling out a rusted metal tin. He opened it and carefully counted the money inside, mostly crumpled dollar bills and a handful of coins. His fingers trembled slightly as he did the math in his head. Almost there. Just a few more days. Asterisk, asterisk. The thought filled him with a fragile sense of relief. He tucked the tin back into its hiding spot and leaned against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment. The weight of the day hung heavy on his small shoulders, but there was no time to rest. He still had to make dinner. Michael shuffled into the kitchen, stirring a pot of simple vegetable soup. As he stood at the stove, stirring absent-mindedly, his mind drifted toward tomorrow, another day of selling, another day closer to the medicine. He was exhausted, but hope flickered in the back of his mind like a tiny flame, refusing to go out. Then came the sound of the front door slamming open. Michael froze. Jack! Heavy, uneven footsteps echoed through the apartment, followed by the unmistakable thud of the door closing behind him. Jack's presence was like a storm. Whenever he appeared, chaos followed. Michael heard the clink of keys dropped carelessly on the table, the shuffle of his older brother's boots as he paced the living room like a caged animal. Michael knew that walk. Jack was desperate. Again. The boy left the kitchen slowly, his heart beating faster with each step. Jack stood in the center of the living room, his tall frame hunched, eyes darting around the apartment like a thief in his own home. There was a jittery energy to him, one that always meant trouble. "I need money, Michael." Jack's voice was sharp, almost frantic. His dark eyes bore into his little brother's, full of desperation. Michael swallowed hard, his small hands clenching into fists by his sides. "I don't have anything, Jack. I told you before, it's all for Grandma's medicine." Jack took a step forward, his jaw tight, frustration flickering across his face. "You think I don't know that? But I need it now, Michael." Michael's chest tightened, fear mixing with anger. Jack had pulled stunts before, but this time it felt different, like a man on the edge of something dangerous. "You can't have it, Jack," Michael said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Grandma needs it. Please." Jack's face twisted, a flash of guilt crossing his features before being swallowed by something darker. Panic, maybe, or shame. "I don't have time for this," he snapped. Without warning, he shoved Michael aside with one rough push. The boy stumbled but managed to catch himself before falling. "Jack, don't please," Michael shouted, his voice breaking. "That's all we have." But Jack didn't stop. He stormed into Michael's room, throwing open the closet door with a loud bang. Michael scrambled after him, panic rising in his chest like a flood. "Jack, don't. Please." It's for her. But his pleas fell on deaf ears. Jack ripped the tin from its hiding spot and pried it open. For a moment, he stared at the crumpled bills inside, breathing hard, as if the sight of the money gave him both relief and shame at once. Michael stood frozen in the doorway, helpless as his brother pocketed the cash. Jack avoided his gaze, maybe because he knew what he was doing was wrong, or maybe because he couldn't bear to see the betrayal on Michael's face. Without another word, Jack pushed past him and headed for the door. "I'll pay you back," he mumbled, though both of them knew it was a lie. Michael stood there, rooted in place, tears burning in his eyes but refusing to fall. What was the point? Crying wouldn't bring the money back. Crying wouldn't help Grandma. The door slammed shut behind Jack, leaving Michael alone in the silence. He stayed there for a long moment, staring at the spot where the tin had been, his chest tight with the weight of helplessness. Everything he'd worked for was gone. Finally, he sank to the floor, pressing his fists against his eyes to keep the tears at bay. For a moment, he let himself feel the crushing loss, the anger, the frustration, everything swirling inside him like a storm. But he couldn't stay there. Grandma needed him, and time wasn't on their side. Michael wiped his eyes, took a deep breath, and forced himself to stand. Tomorrow, he'd have to start again tomorrow. There was no other choice. The next morning, Michael stood on the sidewalk with his fruit cart, his hands nervously adjusting apples and oranges. His heart was heavy with the memory of the night before. Jack had taken everything, every cent he'd worked for. But there was no time to dwell on it. Margaret needed him, and there was no other option. He'd start over from scratch. He repeated the words like a mantra, trying to convince himself. One sale at a time. I can do this. His voice was hoarse as he called out to passers-by. Fresh apples, sweet oranges, just 50 cents each. He kept his head down, focusing on the movement of people and the weight of the coins in his pocket. Just a handful so far. Not nearly enough. His stomach twisted with worry, but he pressed on. He couldn't let her down. Then, without warning, a sleek black car rolled to a stop next to him, the shine of its exterior glinting in the morning light. The car door clicked open with a soft, deliberate sound, and a man stepped out. The man was tall and elegantly dressed in a sharp gray suit, his silver hair combed back neatly. Everything about him, from his polished shoes to the calm, measured way he moved, spoke of wealth and control. But it was his eyes that caught Michael's attention. They weren't cold like Jack's. They were steady, kind, and piercing, as if the man saw far more than he let on. "You must be Michael," the man said, a small but genuine smile touching his lips. Michael took a cautious step back, gripping the edge of his fruit cart. "Yeah, who's asking?" His voice was low, defensive. Strangers never approached him without a reason, and experience had taught him to be careful. "My name is William Harrison," the man replied, his tone warm but controlled. "I knew your parents a long time ago." The mention of his parents sent a chill through Michael's chest. Few people ever talked about them. He looked the man up and down, confusion and suspicion swirling in his mind. "How do you know my name? And why are you here?" William's expression softened. "I heard about your grandmother and about the difficult situation you're in." He paused for a moment, giving the boy space to process. "I owed your parents a great deal. They were very important to me, and when I learned what's been happening, I knew I had to find you." Michael's heart pounded in his chest. His mind raced, trying to connect the dots. Why would a wealthy man, someone with ties to his parents, show up now, after all these years? What did he want from them? "Look, mister," Michael said, narrowing his eyes. "I don't know who you think I am, but I don't need charity. We're doing just fine." It wasn't true, but Michael had learned early that help often came with strings attached. And after Jack's betrayal, trusting anyone felt like a risk he couldn't afford. William gave a small nod, as if he'd expected a resistance. "I understand, Michael. You're trying to handle everything yourself, but you don't have to." He leaned in slightly, his voice low and calm. "I want to help you, not just because of your parents, but because I believe you deserve a chance. Let me help your grandmother." Michael hesitated, torn between suspicion and a growing sense of relief. Could he really trust this man? But as much as he wanted to say no, a part of him knew he couldn't keep doing this alone. Grandma needed him to be strong, and right now, being strong meant accepting help. He exhaled slowly, the weight of his doubts pressing down on him. "Okay," he whispered, still uncertain. "What exactly do you want to do?" William smiled gently, recognizing the fragile trust in Michael's voice. "Why don't we sit down and talk? There's a coffee just down the street. I'll explain everything." The small coffee was quiet, the kind of place where conversations happened in low voices over cups of black coffee. Michael sat across from William at a small table, fidgeting with his hands, his eyes darting between the door and the man sitting calmly in front of him. A waiter set 2 cups of coffee on the table. William took a sip, his movements unhurried, as if he had all the time in the world. "Your parents," William began, "were remarkable people. Your father was one of the most honest men I've ever met, and your mother, well, she was the kind of person who made others feel seen and heard, no matter who they were." Michael swallowed hard, feeling the familiar ache of loss well up in his chest. He rarely heard anyone talk about his parents like this, with such warmth and respect. "I promised them once," William continued, "that if they ever needed anything, I'd be there. And though it took me longer than it should have, I'm here now. I want to make sure your grandmother gets the care she needs." Michael looked down at his hands, struggling to keep his emotions in check. He wanted to believe him, wanted to believe that someone had finally come to help without expecting anything in return. But life had taught him to be careful. "Why now?" Michael asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why are you helping us after all this time?" William didn't flinch. "Because I failed them once," he admitted quietly, "and I promised myself I'd never make that mistake again." There was something in his voice, a kind of regret that Michael recognized, because it was the same weight he carried every day, the weight of feeling like you hadn't done enough. Michael stared at the man in silence, the walls around his heart cracking just a little. What choice did he really have? The money was gone, and Margaret's condition was getting worse. If this man could give her the care she needed, didn't he owe it to her to try? "Okay," Michael said, the words heavy but resolute. "We can go back to the house. But just so you know, if you try anything weird, I'll know." William chuckled softly, not in mockery, but in understanding. "Fair enough, Michael. I wouldn't expect anything less." They walked back to the small apartment together, the silence between them not awkward, but thoughtful. Michael kept sneaking glances at William, still unsure what to make of the man in the suit who seemed too good to be true. But for the first time in a long while, a small flicker of hope ignited in his chest. When they arrived at the apartment, Michael hesitated at the door, suddenly nervous. Would Grandma even want this kind of help? But when he opened the door and they stepped inside, his worries were immediately silenced. Margaret was lying on the couch, her frail frame barely visible under the blanket draped over her. Her eyes fluttered open, and when she saw William standing there, a soft smile spread across her face, one Michael hadn't seen in a long time. "So, you came back after all," she whispered, her voice weak but filled with warmth. William knelt beside her, taking her hand gently in his. "I told you I would, Margaret." The way they looked at each other, like old friends reunited after a lifetime apart, made Michael's heart ache in a way he couldn't explain. How did they know each other? What had happened between them all those years ago? Asterisk, asterisk. But now wasn't the time for questions. Margaret needed help, and William was offering it. That was all that mattered for now. Michael stood by the door, watching the two of them, and for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, things might get better. While William was mapping out the next steps to ensure Margaret got the care she needed, Jack was sinking deeper into trouble. He had thought the money stolen from Michael would buy him more time. Time to negotiate, time to run, or at least find another way out. But the handful of bills he pocketed that night had barely made a dent in what he owed Victor Malone, a man whose reputation alone was enough to make seasoned criminals shiver. Victor wasn't just any loan shark. He was precise, brutal, and unflinchingly ruthless. His name carried a weight that warned people to pay up on time or disappear. And Jack had failed him badly. Desperation clouded Jack's judgment, leading him to make the worst decision possible. He tried to steal from Victor directly. He knew where Malone's men stashed money between collections. Small-time cash drops used to keep things running smoothly. If Jack could grab enough, maybe he'd pay off his debt or at least buy a ticket out of the city. But the plan was foolish from the start. The moment Jack's hands closed around the cash hidden inside an old, stained duffel bag, he knew he'd screwed up. Before he even made it to the exit of the decrepit building, Victor's men were on him. They hit him hard. Blows to the ribs, kicks that left him breathless on the dirty floor. "Where do you think you're going with that?" One of the men sneered, yanking the bag from Jack's hands. Jack coughed, trying to push himself to his knees, but a boot pressed down on his shoulder, forcing him back to the ground. "You really thought you could steal from Malone?" They dragged him by his arms, ignoring his protests and weak struggles, and threw him into the back of a black van. Jack knew, without a doubt, that he wasn't getting out of this one easily. Malone's men didn't just break bones. They sent messages. They drove in silence, the van bouncing over potholes. Jack's heart pounded in his chest, a dull rhythm of panic that kept rising. His mind raced through every possible way out of this mess, but there were no options left. No one to call. No one coming to save him. By the time they reached their destination, a dark, abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, Jack felt like the air had been sucked out of his lungs. The men hauled him out of the van and shoved him through the rusted doors. Inside, the air was thick with dust and oil, and the shadows seemed to swallow everything. And there, waiting in the center of the room, stood Victor Malone. Victor wasn't a large man, but he didn't need to be. He carried himself with an eerie calm, the kind that comes from knowing you have complete control over everyone and everything around you. His tailored suit was crisp, his salt and pepper hair neatly combed back. But it was his eyes, cold, calculating, and pitiless, that made Jack's stomach churn with fear. Malone smiled, a slow, deliberate curve of his lips that didn't reach his eyes. Jack. His voice was quiet, but it carried a weight that made Jack's knees feel weak. I have to admit, you've got guts. Stupid, reckless guts. But guts. Nonetheless, Jack swallowed hard, his throat dry. I can get the money, I swear. Just give me a little more time. Victor's smile didn't waver, but the room felt colder. Time, he echoed, as if the word itself was foreign to him. He took a step closer, the sound of his shoes clicking softly against the concrete. You were already out of time, kid. That's why you stole from me, isn't it? Jack opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. What could he say? The truth wouldn't save him. He had made a fatal mistake, and now there was nowhere left to run. Victor gestured casually to one of his men, who stepped forward and delivered a sharp punch to Jack's stomach. The air rushed out of his lungs in a painful gasp, and he doubled over, clutching his ribs. Do you know what your biggest problem is, Jack? Victor asked, his tone light, almost conversational. It's not that you're unlucky. It's not even that you're a thief. He crouched down, his face now level with Jack's. His cold eyes locked onto Jack's, and the smile faded. Your biggest problem is that you think I'm the kind of man you can play games with. Jack's heart thundered in his chest. I wasn't trying to. Victor held up a hand, silencing him. The problem with people like you, Jack, is that you never know when to stop. You think you're invincible, like the world owes you something. He stood slowly, straightening his suit with a flick of his wrist. And now, you're going to learn what happens to people who don't respect the rules. Jack's breath hitched. He knew what was coming. He had seen it happen to others. Beatings that left men in the hospital for weeks. Threats that hung over their families like dark clouds. And worse, sometimes people just vanished. Victor gave a small nod, and one of his men grabbed Jack by the collar, hauling him upright. Jack's legs felt like jelly, but he forced himself to stand. He had to think, had to say something, anything, to buy himself time. Please, Malone, I can fix this. Asterisk, asterisk, Jack whispered, his voice barely holding together. I swear, just give me a chance. Victor studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. Then, without warning, he leaned in close, his voice low and cold. You've already used up all your chances, Jack. Jack's pulse raced as he was shoved backward into a metal chair. His hands were tied behind him, the rope biting into his skin. Panic clawed at his chest, threatening to overwhelm him. This was it. This was where it ended, asterisk, asterisk. Victor lit a cigarette, inhaling deeply before exhaling a thin stream of smoke. Do you know why people respect me, Jack? He asked, almost casually. Because I never give second chances. One mistake, and you pay. Jack clenched his jaw, trying to keep the fear from showing on his face. He couldn't let Malone see him break. Victor stepped closer, the cigarette dangling between his fingers. I should kill you right here. He paused, letting the words sink in. but I think there's still something I can use you for." Jack's heart skipped a beat. What did that mean? Was Malone offering him a way out, or just prolonging the inevitable? Victor gave a sharp nod to one of his men. "Keep him here. I'll decide what to do with him later." The men grabbed Jack again, dragging him across the cold floor toward a corner of the warehouse. They left him tied to the chair, bruised, bleeding, and terrified. The door slammed shut behind them, leaving Jack alone with nothing but the sound of his own ragged breathing. Jack leaned his head back, gasping for air as the weight of his mistakes crashed down on him. There was no way out. No one knew where he was. No one was coming to save him. He thought of Michael, the look on his little brother's face when he took the last of the money. I really screwed up this time. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt something close to regret. But regret wasn't going to get him out of this. Not with Victor Malone waiting to decide his fate. And deep down, Jack knew, asterisk, asterisk, his time was running out, asterisk, asterisk. Back at the apartment, Michael sat on the worn couch, his hands nervously wringing together. No matter how hard he tried to focus on Margaret's recovery, something gnawed at him. Jack was missing, and while his brother had done some unforgivable things, leaving him out there, alone in trouble, felt wrong. Michael knew Jack had taken the money, but guilt tugged at him. He's still my brother. The hours ticked by, and Michael's anxiety grew heavier with every passing minute. Jack might have been reckless, but he was always around, hovering on the fringes, crashing through the door when he needed something. But this silence, it was different, and it scared him. William noticed the boy's restless movements, the way his fingers tapped against the armrest, his brow furrowed in thought. He closed the book he'd been reading and leaned forward slightly. "What's on your mind, Michael?" Michael hesitated. Part of him didn't want to say it aloud, as if acknowledging the thought might make it real. But the worry was a knot tightening in his chest, and he couldn't hold it in any longer. "It's Jack," Michael admitted quietly. "He hasn't come back." William gave a slow nod, his expression calm but attentive. "I see." He waited for Michael to say more, giving the boy space to untangle his thoughts. "I know what he did was wrong," Michael continued, guilt flickering in his voice. "But he's in trouble. I can feel it." William leaned back, thoughtful. He'd seen this before. Kids like Jack slipping deeper into dangerous waters, drawn into a world that didn't let go easily. The boy sitting in front of him was different, though. Michael still had a chance, still fought to do the right thing, even when it hurt. "If something happens to him," Michael trailed off, his throat tightening. "He's my brother, William. I can't just do nothing." William studied Michael for a long moment, then nodded with quiet determination. "We'll find him," he said firmly. "But we have to move quickly and carefully." Michael's chest tightened, both with relief and fear. They were going after Jack, but the question loomed. What if they were already too late? William pulled out his phone, his fingers moving swiftly as he sent a series of texts and calls. His voice was low and measured, but Michael could hear the authority behind every word. This wasn't the first time William had dealt with dangerous situations. Michael sat still, his legs bouncing anxiously as he waited for any kind of news. "I have some contacts in law enforcement," William said after hanging up. "They'll help us figure out where Jack is. But I need you to understand something, Michael." The boy straightened, looking up at him. "This could get complicated. If your brother got involved with someone dangerous, we may not have much time." Michael swallowed hard, but he nodded. He knew Jack was in deep. He'd seen it coming for months. The bruises, the odd hours, the way Jack started avoiding their apartment for days at a time. "What do we do now?" Michael asked, his voice low but steady. William's expression didn't waver. We wait for a location. As soon as we have one, we move. Michael clenched his fists to keep his hands from shaking. Waiting felt like torture. Every minute that passed only made the dread in his chest grow heavier. But he forced himself to stay calm. Jack was out there, and he needed him. The hours dragged. Michael sat hunched on the couch, stealing glances at William's phone every time it buzzed. William remained collected, scrolling through contacts and following up on calls, his calm demeanor reassuring Michael even though his nerves were frayed. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the phone rang, and this time, William's expression shifted slightly. "Got it," William murmured into the receiver. He stood, pacing slowly across the room as he listened. "Warehouse on the west side. No signs of a transfer yet. Good. Keep your team on standby, and I'll handle the rest." Michael sat up, his heart pounding. Did they find him? William ended the call and slipped the phone into his pocket. "They've tracked him to an old warehouse," he said. "He's there, but we don't know for how long." Michael's stomach twisted. A warehouse, that could only mean one thing. Jack was in serious trouble. "We have to go now," Michael said, his voice firm. "Before it's too late." William placed a steady hand on Michael's shoulder, grounding him. "Listen to me, Michael. I know you want to run in there and save him, but we have to be smart about this. If Jack is with the wrong people, rushing him will only make things worse." Michael clenched his jaw, frustrated but knowing William was right. "So, what's the plan?" William gave a slight smile. "We go in carefully. I've called in some backup. They'll be nearby, just in case. But we'll get him out, Michael. One way or another." Michael nodded, his heart still racing but anchored by William's steady presence. They were going to get Jack out, whatever it took. William grabbed his coat, and Michael followed close behind. As they headed toward the door, the weight of what they were about to do settled over both of them. There were no guarantees, and Michael knew it. But Jack was his brother. Family meant you didn't give up, no matter what. Before they stepped outside, William paused, turning to Michael. "One more thing," he said. "When we get there, you stay close to me. No matter what happens, you do exactly what I say. Understood?" Michael nodded. "I understand." William gave him a reassuring pat on the back. "Good. Let's bring him home." As they walked down the dimly lit street, Michael felt the tension winding tighter in his chest. The fear, the uncertainty was all there. But so was something else. Hope. This was their chance to bring Jack back before it was too late. The black SUV slowed to a stop a few blocks from the warehouse, its tires crunching over the cracked pavement. Inside, William sat calmly in the driver's seat, while Michael leaned forward in the back, gripping the edge of the seat so tightly his knuckles turned white. They could see the faint silhouette of the warehouse up ahead, its dark metal structure looming like a silent threat. "Is this really going to work?" Michael whispered, his voice heavy with fear. William glanced at him through the rear-view mirror, his expression steady but serious. "We've done everything we can to prepare," he said. "Now we just have to trust the plan." Michael tried to take comfort in William's calmness, but his heart wouldn't stop racing. Jack was in that warehouse, trapped, tied up, and surrounded by dangerous men. Every second that passed felt like sand slipping through an hourglass. What if they were too late? What if Jack didn't make it out? Asterisk, asterisk. A voice crackled through William's police radio. "Team is in position, ready to breach on your signal." William lifted the radio and responded, his tone sharp and controlled. "Wait for my call. Move only when I give the order." Michael shifted nervously in his seat. "Why are we waiting?" he asked, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "We know he's in there. Why can't they just go in?" William turned to face Michael fully now, his gaze firm but kind. "Because if we move too soon, Victor might panic, and someone could get hurt. We need to do this right." Michael swallowed hard and nodded, though every fiber of his being screamed to kick down the door and drag Jack out himself. But that wasn't how the world worked, not when men like Victor Malone were involved. Inside the warehouse, Jack sat slumped in the chair, his wrists burning from the ropes that bit into his skin. He could feel sweat trickling down his back as panic gnawed at his insides. "They're going to kill me," he knew it with a grim certainty. Malone wouldn't let him walk away from this, not after what he'd done. Victor stood a few feet away, casually smoking a cigarette, as if Jack were nothing more than a mild inconvenience. The other men loomed nearby, watching with cold, empty expressions. "You've been real quiet, Jack," Victor said, exhaling a slow stream of smoke. "That's not like you." Jack looked up, his breathing ragged, pain etched into every line of his face. "What do you want me to say?" he muttered, his voice hoarse. "You're gonna kill me anyway." Victor chuckled softly, a sound that sent a chill down Jack's spine. "Smart boy. You know how this works." He flicked the cigarette to the floor, crushing it under his shoe with deliberate slowness. "But I'm still trying to decide just how painful this needs to be." Jack clenched his jaw, refusing to show how terrified he was. But it was getting harder to breathe, harder to keep the panic from swallowing him whole. He needed a miracle, and fast. Outside, the tension mounted as William kept his eyes locked on the dark outline of the warehouse. "All right," he said quietly, lifting the radio. "We move now." Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he watched the officers spring into action. From their hiding spots along the alleyways, a tactical team moved toward the warehouse like shadows in the night. They wore black gear and helmets, rifles raised, their steps silent but purposeful. Michael pressed his forehead against the window, willing them to be faster. "Please, get to him in time, **. Entry team, breach on my mark," William said into the radio. 3, 2, 1, go. A deafening explosion shattered the silence as the warehouse door was blown open by a flashbang grenade. Light burst into the dark space, followed by the sound of heavy boots thundering inside. Inside, the sudden blast stunned everyone. Jack flinched as the door flew off its hinges, blinding white light flooding the room. The sharp sound of shouting followed. Commands barked from men in uniform. "Police!" Down on the ground, Victor cursed under his breath, grabbing for the pistol tucked into his waistband. But before he could aim, a bullet whizzed past his head, forcing him to duck behind a stack of crates. Move! Chaos erupted. Victor's men scrambled for cover, but the tactical team was too quick. Shots echoed through the warehouse, short bursts of gunfire cutting through the air. Jack twisted against the ropes binding his wrists, desperation giving him strength. They were here for him. He just had to survive a little longer. One of Victor's men lunged toward Jack, a knife gleaming in his hand. But before he could strike, a bullet dropped him to the ground lifeless. Jack's heart raced as he looked toward the entrance, just in time to see officers swarming into the room. A flood of relief washed over him. Though his hands still shook violently, he wasn't dead. Not yet. Victor made a break for the side door, his sharp gaze scanning for an exit. But William's team was prepared. "We've got a runner," an officer called over the radio. 2 officers intercepted Victor just as he reached the door. He spun, fury blazing in his eyes. But before he could lift his gun, one officer tackled him to the ground. They pinned him there, wresting the weapon from his grip. "Stay down," one officer barked, pressing a knee into Victor's back. Victor snarled, thrashing under their grip, but it was over. The cuffs clicked into place, and Malone's reign of fear ended with a dull thud against the concrete. Michael's breath hitched as he saw the officers dragging Victor out of the building, but his eyes kept scanning the entrance, searching desperately for his brother. Where is he? Where's Jack? Asterisk, asterisk. Then, finally, Jack stumbled out, flanked by two officers. His face was bruised, and his clothes were torn, but he was alive. Michael jumped out of the car, his heart pounding in his chest. "Jack!" Jack's head snapped up at the sound of his brother's voice. For a moment, the two just stared at each other, disbelief and relief mingling in their expressions. Then Jack gave a weak, lopsided smile. "You really came for me, huh?" Michael ran to him, wrapping his arms tightly around his brother's waist. Jack winced at the contact, but didn't pull away. He rested his chin on Michael's head, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "I thought I was done for." "You're not," Michael whispered fiercely. "You're not done. You're coming home." William approached them slowly, giving the brothers a moment. "It's over, Jack," he said quietly. "Victor's done. He won't hurt you or anyone else again." Jack nodded. Though his legs wobbled beneath him, the nightmare was finally over. Michael looked up at William, gratitude shining in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered, "for everything." William gave a small, reassuring nod. "Let's get him to the hospital," he said, gesturing toward the waiting vehicles. "He needs to be checked out." Jack chuckled weakly as Michael helped him toward the car. "A hospital sounds good. Maybe a sandwich, too." Michael rolled his eyes but smiled, the weight in his chest finally lifting. "Yeah, Jack, we'll get you a sandwich." As they loaded Jack into the car, Michael sat beside him, keeping a hand on his brother's shoulder as if to anchor him. The chaos was behind them now, but the journey wasn't over. They'd made it this far, and they weren't giving up now. The hospital room was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of machines and the occasional footsteps of nurses in the hall outside. Jack lay on the stiff bed, pale and battered. His body ached with every breath, and the bruises on his ribs made even the smallest movement feel like a punishment. But none of the physical pain compared to the guilt weighing on his chest. It sat there like a stone, heavy and unforgiving, as if daring him to confront the damage he had caused. The door creaked open, and Jack turned his head slowly toward it. His heart sank as he saw Michael step inside, his little brother's familiar face a mixture of exhaustion, worry, and something else, something Jack couldn't quite name. For a moment, Michael stood there, just looking at him. The sight of Jack, so broken, both inside and out, made Michael's chest tighten with complicated emotions. Anger still simmered somewhere in the background, but it was softened by concern, and beneath it all, the familiar ache of love. Despite everything, Jack was still his brother, and no matter how far Jack had fallen, Michael couldn't walk away. Not now. Jack's throat tightened, and before he could stop himself, tears welled up in his eyes. "Michael," his voice cracked, thick with emotion. "I'm so sorry." Michael stayed silent, stepping closer to the bed. Jack's tears came faster now, guilt pouring out in every word. "I was horrible to you. I took the money, put everyone in danger. Because of me, Grandma." Asterisk, asterisk, Jack choked on the words, unable to finish. "I ruined everything." He dragged a hand down his face, ashamed of the tears, ashamed of the mess he'd made of their lives. "I thought I could fix it, you know, that I'd pay Malone back, and you'd never even find out." Jack shook his head bitterly. "But all I did was make things worse. I hurt you, Michael. I hurt everyone." Michael felt the familiar sting of tears prickling at the edges of his eyes, but he blinked them away. He couldn't let Jack's words break him, not now. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat beside the bed, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked at his brother, really looked at him. The bruises, the fear, the regret etched into every line of Jack's face. Asterisk. "Yeah," Michael whispered, finally breaking the silence. "You screwed up. Big time." Jack let out a shaky laugh, though it sounded more like a sob. That's putting it lightly. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they'd been through hung heavy in the room. Then, Michael took a deep breath and leaned closer, his voice steady but soft. "You hurt me, Jack. You stole from me. And for a long time, it felt like you weren't my brother anymore. It felt like..." Michael paused, struggling to find the words. "Like I'd lost you." Jack shut his eyes, his tears falling freely now. "I thought I'd lost myself too," he whispered. Michael gave him a small, tired smile. "But you didn't." Jack opened his eyes, meeting Michael's steady gaze. In those dark brown eyes, Jack saw something he didn't think he deserved. Forgiveness. Real, unconditional forgiveness. It was there, as clear as the air between them, and that forgiveness, coming from the one person Jack thought he'd hurt beyond repair, broke him in a way nothing else ever had. "How can you still forgive me?" Jack asked, his voice fragile, like he was afraid the answer might shatter him. Michael shrugged, but there was no hesitation in his words. "Because you're my brother," Jack sniffled, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. "I don't deserve it." "Maybe not," Michael admitted, his voice kind but firm. "But family isn't about deserving. It's about not giving up on each other." Jack let out a ragged breath, the tension he'd been carrying for so long slowly unraveling. For the first time in what felt like forever, the walls he had built around himself started to crumble. I don't know how to fix this," Jack whispered. "I don't even know where to start." Michael reached out and placed a hand on Jack's arm, squeezing it gently. "We'll figure it out," he said. Together, Jack stared at his brother, disbelief flickering in his eyes. He had expected anger, rejection, maybe even hatred, but instead, Michael had given him something far more powerful, a second chance. "I'm going to do better," Jack promised, his voice trembling with emotion. "I swear, Michael. No more running, no more lies. I'm done with that life." Michael nodded, a small but hopeful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "I know, Jack." Jack let his head sink back against the pillow, his chest rising and falling with deep, unsteady breaths. The weight of guilt was still there, but it no longer felt unbearable. For the first time in a long while, Jack felt like he could breathe. Michael sat with him in silence, neither of them needing to say anything more. This wasn't the end of their problems. There would still be hard days ahead, but they would face them together. A soft knock sounded at the door, and both brothers looked up as William stepped inside. His expression was calm but pleased, as if he could sense that something important had just shifted between the two boys. "How's he doing?" William asked, glancing between them. Michael gave a small smile. "He's going to be okay." Jack managed a weak chuckle. "I'm not dead, at least." William raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching in amusement. "That's a start." He crossed the room, resting a hand on Michael's shoulder. "You did good, kid." Both of you. Jack looked down at his hands, the weight of everything still settling, but for once, it didn't feel overwhelming. He glanced up at William, hesitant but grateful. Thanks for not giving up on me. William gave a small nod, his expression sincere. Everyone deserves a chance to start over, Jack. Even you. As the room fell quiet again, Michael knew they had crossed a threshold, a place where forgiveness, hope, and the possibility of something new could begin. The road ahead would be tough, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't walking it alone. Jack was here, and he was choosing to stay ***, and no matter what came next, they would face it together. Margaret sat in her reclining chair by the window, a soft blanket draped across her lap. Her hands, still thin and frail, rested lightly on the book she wasn't really reading. She looked out at the world beyond the glass, her eyes following the people passing by on the street below. And for the first time in months, maybe even years, a gentle smile curled at the corners of her mouth. It was subtle, but it was there. Hope. The treatment was working, though her recovery would take time. Some days were harder than others. But Margaret wasn't alone anymore, and that made all the difference. Michael sat next to her, peeling an orange with the precision of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. He handed her a slice, and she gave him a grateful look. "You've taken such good care of me, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice still soft, but no longer as strained as it had been. "It's not just me," Michael replied, glancing toward the door. "Jack's helping too." Margaret's smile grew just a little. "I always knew he had it in him, just needed to find his way back." Jack was finding his way back, one step at a time, and each step felt like dragging himself out of a deep pit. The program William had helped him get into wasn't easy, but Jack was determined. Every day was a battle against the habits and demons that had once owned him. But now, he fought differently. He fought because he wanted to be better, for himself, for Michael, and for Margaret. At first, the program had felt like a punishment, like a weight tied to his ankles. But something shifted as the weeks went by. The sessions weren't just about quitting bad habits. They were about learning to forgive himself. One night after a meeting, Jack called Michael. "I've been thinking a lot," Jack said, his voice hesitant but sincere. "I wasted so much time trying to run from everything, from you, from Grandma, from myself. I don't want to waste any more time." Michael was quiet for a moment, processing his brother's words. Then, with a warmth that Jack hadn't heard in years, he responded, "We've got time now, Jack. We're not going anywhere." Those words stayed with Jack, a small anchor in the storm that sometimes tried to pull him back. After Jack's meetings, he would meet Michael by the corner of the street market, where the fruit cart stood waiting. The first day Jack returned to the cart, he'd hesitated, hands shoved deep in his pockets, unsure if he still had a place there. But Michael saw him standing at a distance, and without saying a word, he waved him over, like it was the most natural thing in the world. "You ready to get to work?" Michael asked, tossing Jack an apron. Jack caught it, a grin spreading across his face. "Yeah, I'm ready." That day, they sold fruit side by side, but it wasn't just about the money this time. It was about rebuilding. Not just their business, but their bond as brothers. Every sale, every laugh, every shared glance was a step forward. They were healing little by little, and it showed in the way they worked together. One afternoon, Jack leaned against the fruit cart, wiping sweat from his brow as the last customer of the day walked away with a bag of apples. "Not bad," he said, glancing over at Michael. "You've gotten pretty good at this." Michael smirked. "Better than you ever were." Jack chuckled, and the sound was genuine, something Michael hadn't heard in a long time. "You might be right about that," Jack admitted, "but at least I'm not running from it anymore." Michael's expression softened, pride flickering in his eyes. "Yeah, you're not." They finished packing up the cart together, moving in sync like they had when they were kids, playing in the streets without a care in the world. "You know," Jack said as they secured the cart for the day, "I've been thinking about expanding the business." Michael shot him a curious look. "Expanding?" Jack nodded, a playful grin forming. "Yeah, I mean, we've got this whole fruit thing down. Maybe we start selling something else too. I hear people are crazy for smoothies these days." Michael laughed, rolling his eyes. "Smoothies, huh? You're really aiming high. Hey, gotta dream big, right?" Jack said, nudging his brother's shoulder. "We're in this together now, remember?" Michael smiled, and for a moment, the weight of everything they'd been through felt distant, a shadow that was slowly fading in the light of something new. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building asterisk. Later that evening, after dropping off the cart, they walked back to the apartment side by side. It felt good, natural, even. The silence between them wasn't heavy like it used to be. It was comfortable, filled with the unspoken understanding that they had both changed, and they weren't alone anymore. When they reached the door, Margaret was waiting for them, her eyes twinkling with quiet joy at the sight of her two boys together. Jack leaned down and kissed her cheek, something he hadn't done in years. "We're home, Grandma," he whispered, "and we're staying this time." Margaret's smile was soft but full of meaning. "That's all I ever wanted." That night, Michael sat at the small dining table, watching as Jack scribbled ideas in a notebook, half serious business plans, half jokes about selling the world's best smoothies. It felt strange to see his brother like this, hopeful, present, happy. But it felt right. As Michael leaned back in his chair, a quiet thought settled in his mind. We've made it this far. We can go even further, asterisk. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Michael believed it. They weren't just picking up the broken pieces anymore. They were building something new. Together, asterisk. With time, William's presence became more than just occasional visits or gestures of goodwill. He became a steady fixture in their lives, someone they could count on. His once formal check-ins transformed into something warmer. Dinners that stretched late into the evening, filled with stories, laughter, and moments that felt like home. He sat at their table not as a distant benefactor, but as someone who belonged. Margaret, though still physically limited, had a lightness about her now, as if the burden she'd carried for so long had finally been lifted. She watched her grandsons with a quiet joy, her heart full as they leaned on one another in ways they hadn't before. Her voice was still soft from the strain of illness, but her words carried the strength of someone who had survived. "You boys make me prouder than you'll ever know," she often told them, her gaze lingering on each of them in turn. "Seeing you together like this, that's all I ever prayed for." Jack would usually respond with a playful grin, but the look in his eyes told the real story. He meant every word of his promise to her. He wasn't going anywhere. Michael, who had grown so used to carrying the world alone, slowly learned what it felt like to share the weight. The strain that had once bowed his shoulders eased little by little, replaced by a sense of trust, not just in Jack, but in William, in Margaret, and in himself. He didn't have to do everything alone anymore. One evening, as they sat together at the small dining table, Michael glanced around and realized something had shifted, something fundamental. The tension that had once lived in the corners of their conversations was gone. Where there had been resentment and regret, now there was warmth and understanding. Even their silences felt different. They weren't the heavy, uncomfortable pauses of the past. These silences were filled with peace. One night, as they were finishing dinner, William leaned back in his chair, a rare softness in his usually composed expression. "You know," he said, glancing between Michael and Jack, "I think you two are starting to make this family thing look easy." Jack snorted, wiping his mouth with a napkin. "Yeah, well, it took us a while to get here." Margaret smiled knowingly from her place at the table, her eyes twinkling. "The best things always take time." Michael, sitting across from his brother, gave him a small but genuine smile. "Yeah," he said quietly, "but it's worth it." Jack met his brother's gaze, something unspoken passing between them. A shared understanding, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had been through to get to this moment. "It is," Jack agreed, his voice low but filled with sincerity. "It really is." As the months went by, Jack continued to rebuild his life, one small step at a time. There were still challenges, days when old temptations tried to creep back, moments when the weight of his mistakes resurfaced. But this time, Jack didn't run from them. Whenever those moments hit, he'd find himself leaning on Michael. And Michael was always there. Just as Jack had promised he would be, they weren't perfect. Some days were hard and old habits didn't break easily. But they kept moving forward one step at a time. The small fruit business they had built together began to grow, not just as a source of income, but as a shared mission. It wasn't just about selling fruit anymore. It was about proving to themselves and to each other that they could build something that lasted. On a crisp Saturday morning, Michael and Jack stood side by side at the fruit cart, arranging apples in neat rows. "You think we'll ever outgrow this thing?" Jack asked, glancing down at the well-worn cart. Michael smirked. "Probably, but we'll keep it around, just in case." Jack chuckled, nudging his brother's shoulder. "Sentimental, huh?" Michael shrugged, a playful grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Hey, it got us this far, didn't it?" Jack looked at the cart for a moment, his expression softening. It wasn't just a cart anymore. It was a symbol of everything they had fought for, everything they had survived. "Yeah," Jack murmured. "It did." That afternoon, they packed up the cart together, moving with the ease of two people who had learned how to work in sync. When they finished, they walked back home side by side, their steps unhurried and comfortable. Margaret was waiting for them at the apartment, sitting by the window as always, her hands folded gently in her lap. When she saw her grandsons walk through the door, her smile was soft but radiant, a smile that said more than words ever could. Jack leaned down to kiss her cheek, and Margaret cupped his face with a frail but loving hand. "You boys are doing just fine," she whispered. "Just fine." As the sun dipped below the horizon that evening, the four of them gathered around the table. Jack, Michael, Margaret, and William, sharing a meal and the kind of conversation that felt easy and familiar. Laughter floated through the room, filling the spaces that had once been occupied by silence and sorrow. There were no grand speeches, no dramatic revelations, just a quiet, steady presence of people who had chosen to stand by each other, no matter what. And in that moment, Michael knew something with absolute certainty. They were a family. Not perfect, not without flaws, but real asterisk, and that was enough. Later that night, as Michael lay in bed staring at the ceiling, a sense of peace settled over him. The road ahead wasn't guaranteed. There would still be challenges, struggles they couldn't foresee, but they were ready for them. Because they weren't just surviving anymore. They were living together, and that made all the difference. Jack's voice drifted from the next room, low and relaxed as he spoke to William about some new business idea, probably another half-joke about smoothies. Margaret's quiet hum of approval floated through the door, followed by soft laughter. Michael smiled to himself, closing his eyes. For the first time in a long while, the future didn't feel like something to fear, it felt like something to look forward to. They hadn't just survived their past. They had rebuilt their lives, brick by brick, one choice at a time. And together, they had become something stronger than before. They had become a family, a real one,